Okay, hi folks. Happy Monday. I'm back. I'm just noticing here how overdue the haircut is, but I think you could tolerate it for now. I will. Um, Hope all you guys are well. I'm hearing from most everybody. Feels good. Um, Next week will be the exam week, which basically means I just give you the exam as a document, and then you just do it whenever you can. It's open phone, open life, open everything, and you just email it back to me basically. We'll figure out the details around it, but it's nothing to worry about. It should be pretty easy for most of you, and it's designed just to kind of get us to the next step here. This week, we're just going to review some of the big picture items under the heading, okay, one last go at the big picture. These things will relate in a general way to what we've done in winter crops, but more as ways of understanding and deciding how to do things or why we do things in gardens and farms. So that's what it means by how soil health creates crop quality and reduces pest problems. It means when we set up our plants to grow, we're really setting up the soil to grow the plants. And this is a discussion of that. First, a few brief sentences from Hemingway. I like this one. The best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them. Right? So you don't really learn much about whether you could trust somebody or not by not trusting them, because of course distrust, if you put off distrust, it makes people act differently. If you distrust someone, they feel like they're expected to be untrustworthy, whereas I feel like if we trust people, it kind of expects trustworthiness. Of course, this doesn't always work, but I think in the end we have to be strong enough to deal with whatever comes from each other, right? Like if we trust them and they let us down, we have to take the responsibility upon ourselves to be strong enough to deal with that deception. I don't know if that means like hurting them or whatever. I don't think that's what that means. It just means like we have enough power in ourselves to cope with it. Another one here: happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know. Ha. So if you're feeling unhappy, it might be because you know too much or you're too smart, which isn't really advocating becoming dumb. It just means it's a co-related activity. Potentially being sad and intelligent at the same time. Of course, this last one's true. We understand this. It's just a cool way of putting it. What we think of as courage is just grace under pressure, right? So seemingly calm and composed when the stakes get higher. That's what courage is. It's nothing particular or super special. It's just being able to do what you got to do even when times it's tough. Okay, let's check it out. So unicorns. I thought that was funny. I don't think these are real unicorns. I think it's kind of a Photoshop situation. The picture here is to represent what life does on its own, which means that most places in the world of nature are pretty diverse with lots of different species, lots of different types of structure, tall things, short things, wide things, long things. In the case of forests or pastures, we see plants growing every which way and blooming at different times. This is very different than a cornfield, right, where you see only corn growing. So this is kind of a clue at what nature likes to do on its own. And perhaps it's a way of understanding what diversity gives the soil, or it gives back to the soil. So, right, when we look at nature, we see a high diversity of species, lots of different kinds of plants in one place. Soil is never exposed. If you walk around in a field or in a forest, there's usually soil doesn't have direct access to sunlight. Any exposed soil gets grown over quickly. So if you see exposed soil, you can usually ask the question, what happened here? And often it's something humans did. We either scraped it with a plow or ran into it or driven over it many times. Or if you see like paths in the forest are exposed soil, and that's because creatures keep stepping on it, like deer and people. There's a balance of decomposition and regrowth. So when I go to the forest, I always see like dead and dying trees and stuff on the forest floor. So there's always large amounts of plants decomposing and large amounts of plants regrowing. There's redundancy, backup plans. So it's like, see, we'll hear all these yellow flowers. There's plenty of yellow flowers to make enough seeds for that species to survive. There's more than enough, in fact. And that those redundancies keep the yellow flowers from going extinct because there's plenty of seeds in the seed bank. And even if most of those seeds get eaten by mice or ground beetles, there's still enough left over to grow. And we see rapid recolonization after disturbance. So when something crazy like this happens, plants and seeds and stuff will germinate in the landslide and cover that soil as quickly as possible. This is a really unfortunate thing. This probably happened because the slope that the soil slid off from was possibly deforested or destabilized through some activity. And then when rains come or earthquakes mix with rains, the soil can slump or slide off the hillside and fill in downstream of itself. This is terrible. I think this was in China, these like block apartments. There's probably all kinds of stuff like underneath this that the soil covered. You see here how it pushed all these cars and things over here. It's crazy. And these are huge excavators, these little blips over here, trying to dig out these people's houses and lives. I mean, what a nightmare, right? But this is kind of what our tillage does on gardens and farms. This is kind of what it mimics, this destructiveness of a landslide and the stirring up of soil and the addition of oxygen to the soil. So when we see, when humans saw these disturbances in nature, this is what we modeled our gardens after, just instinctively. It's like, oh, after a landslide, plants grow really big and tall for a while. And it's because the nutrients and the air was churned up in one place and made for fertile conditions. Another major disturbance that our crops and our farms look like is fire. Like when fire comes through and burns a field or a forest, we see a massive regrowth of new plants afterwards that are taking advantage of the nutrients in the ash that have been liberated and the new access to sunlight. So farmers still do this in some parts of the world where they burn off areas to plant them. We see this in the tropics, called slash and burn. So they burn the forest down and then plant their crops in and harvest crops for several years and then let it go back to forest and come back and burn it down again in 20 or 30 years. And this was a way humans have farmed for a long time in certain areas. But it's a kind of gardening, right? Like instead of tilling up the soil or digging up with a shovel, you burn down what's there, which is a form of tillage, and then plant into the burned off material. So we see this in nature. Destructive events happen: earthquakes, fires, landslides, floods, and then quickly the plants and the microbes and the beasts come back and heal it up again, repair it quickly. And humans became a species that took advantage of this healing and destroy and repair process. We lived in areas where there's lots of turnover and destruction because of the things we ate. We eat animals that live in these areas. We eat berries and roots that grow in these kind of edge zones and these early successional ecosystems. And then our gardens and farms became little models of those ecosystems, like simplified models of destroy and repair environments. So many of the plants, the kinds of plants that heal these soils, are annual plants. That means they germinate from a seed and go to seed in the same year. So many of our crops that we eat are annual plants, and then some of them are crops that grow 3-4 years, like the berries, like raspberries and strawberries and stuff like that. We also use some uh, ground cover as a mimic of what happens in natural systems. We'll use like clover or grass to cover the ground, like in our lawns. And this holds the soil in place and suppresses the growth of other trees and stuff that keep the environment more to our liking. Okay, in these types of systems, pests are basically organisms, plants, animals, bacteria that want in on the job too. They're like, oh, okay, so humans are doing this. We still need to eat. We're still around, so let's eat what they're eating. Some of the pests, like insect pests that grow on our crops, had grown on those types of plants in nature, and now that we have them concentrated in one area, say like corn or cabbage, they start to concentrate in those areas too, because that was their favorite food a long time ago, and they still like it now. So pests, they're just looking for a meal. They just want to live. They usually live in their food. Like bugs, they just kind of hole up in a leaf and curl it or start eating away, and then that's their shelter too. Most pests don't usually completely destroy their homes unless they've got no other option, which means they have no other place to go, or they just have nothing but that to eat. We also find that insect pests will feed on unhealthy or stressed tissue, just like when we're stressed or tired or been drinking too much or whatever it is, we're more likely to catch a cold. It's the same with plants. When they're unhealthy and not growing in the best conditions, they're more likely to attract pests. Weeds, pests as weeds. Weeds are just plants that are out of place or ones that we don't want or can't use. But they have a role to play whenever we expose soil and haven't covered it back up with ground cover or mulch or enough of our own crops. Weeds will take those spaces and roll with them and take advantage of the excess nutrients and light. So by understanding our pests, we start to figure out ways to break into their life cycles. Let's see what kind of time we have. Our tactics on the farm, and ones that you could use too, are to kind of address the soil health problems. So if we see pests, we could take that as a message that we haven't been having the right environment for the plants to grow. So we could look at our fertility. Do we have enough fertility? Are we watering enough? Are we watering too much? These are the things that pests key in on. After that understanding, we could cover crops. So these are the avoidance tactics. The next best thing to do is to make our crops inaccessible to the pests. And I don't know if you've seen the row covers we use at the farm, but we could put those over, and that excludes pests. That lets light and water and air in, but it doesn't allow flying insects or small bugs to get to the crop. That's a pretty cool way to do it. We could shift our planting, like in the indoor winter crops gardens. We could break up pest cycles by not planting the same thing in the same place. If we're having problems with aphids in lettuce, we could grow something different there the next time, like flowers or different types of green species like chard that aren't as susceptible to aphids. So we can shift around the crops and shift around the plants to try to stay ahead of the bugs, especially if we have a certain kind of bug growing out of balance. And our last ditch thing would be to kill the pests. We could do this with pesticides or fire. Sometimes you can flame weeds to kill them, or some bugs are flammable. So the last thing we want to do is use essentially pharmaceutical drugs. Pesticides, chemical pesticides, are the pharmaceuticals of the garden because they're expensive. They have sideline effects and whatnot. We have 10 seconds here. check out this TED Talk video. It's a cool guy in LA doing some gardens. Do the quiz.